The Wind in the Willows by Kenneth Grahame. Chapter 12. The Return of Ulysses. Part 2. The following morning Toad, who had overslept himself as usual, came down to a breakfast disgracefully late, and found on the table a certain quantity of eggshells, some fragments of cold and leathery toast, a coffee pot 3/4 empty, and really very little else, which did not tend to improve his temper, considering that, after all, it was his own house. Through the French windows of the breakfast room, he could see the mole and water rat sitting in the wicker chairs out on the lawn, evidently telling each other stories, roaring with laughter and kicking their short legs up in the air. The badger, who was in an armchair and deep in the morning paper, merely looked up and nodded when Toad entered the room. But Toad knew his man, so he sat down and made the best breakfast he could, merely observing to himself that he would get square with the others sooner or later. When he had nearly finished, the badger looked up and remarked rather shortly, "I'm sorry, Toad, but I'm afraid there's a heavy morning's work in front of you. You see, we really ought to have a banquet at once to celebrate this affair, and it's expected of you. In fact, it's the rule." "Oh, all right," said the Toad readily. "Anything to oblige. Though why on earth you should want to have a banquet in the morning I cannot understand. But you know I do not live to please myself, but merely to find out what my friends want, and then try and arrange it for him, you dear old badger." "Don't pretend to be stupider than you really are," replied the badger crossly, "and don't chuckle and splutter in your coffee when you're talking. It's not manners. What I mean is, the banquet will be at night, of course, but the invitations will have to be written and got off at once, and you've got to write 'em. Now sit down at that table, there's stacks of letter paper on it with Toad Hall at the top in blue and gold, and write invitations to all our friends, and if you stick to it we shall get them out before luncheon, and I'll bear a hand too and take my share of the burden. I'll order the banquet." "What?" cried Toad dismayed. "Me stop indoors and write a lot of rotten letters on a jolly morning like this, when I want to go around my property and set everything and everybody to rights, and swagger about and enjoy myself? Certainly not. I'll see you—" "Stop a minute, though. Why, of course, dear badger. What is my pleasure or convenience compared with that of others? You wish it done, and it shall be done. Go, badger, order the banquet, order what you like. Then join our young friends outside in their innocent mirth, oblivious of me and my cares and toils. I sacrifice this fair morning on the altar of duty and friendship." The badger looked at him very suspiciously, but Toad's frank, open countenance made it difficult to suggest any unworthy motive in this change of attitude. He quitted the room accordingly in the direction of the kitchen, and as soon as the door had closed behind him, Toad hurried to the writing table. A fine idea had occurred to him while he was talking. He would write the invitations, and he would take care to mention the leading part he had taken in the fight, and how he had laid the chief weasel flat, and he would hint at his adventures, and what a career of triumph he had to tell about, and on the fly-leaf he would give a sort of programme of entertainment for the evening, something like this, as he sketched it out in his head. "Speech by Toad. There will be other speeches by Toad during the evening. Address by Toad. Synopsis. Our prism system. The waterways of Old England. Horse stealing and how to deal. Property, its rights and its duties. Back to the land. A typical English squire. Song by Toad, composed by himself. Other compositions by Toad will be sung in the course of the evening by the composer." The idea pleased him mightily, and he worked very hard and got all the letters finished by noon, at which hour it was reported to him that there was a small and rather bedraggled weasel at the door, inquiring timidly whether he could be of any service to the gentleman. Toad swaggered out and found it was one of the prisoners of the previous evening, very respectful and anxious to please. He patted him on the head, shoved the bundle of invitations into his paw, and told him to cut along quick and deliver them as fast as he could, and if he'd like to come back again in the evening, perhaps there might be a shilling for him, or again, perhaps there mightn't. And the poor weasel seemed really grateful and hurried off eagerly to do his mission. When the other animals came back to the luncheon, very boisterous and breezy after a morning on the river, the mole, whose conscience had been pricking him, looked doubtfully at Toad, expecting him to find him sulky or depressed. Instead, he was so uppish and inflated that the mole began to suspect something, while the rat and the badger exchanged significant glances. As soon as the meal was over, Toad thrust his paws deep into his trouser pockets, remarking casually, "Well, look after yourselves, you fellows. Ask for anything you want," and was swaggering off in the direction of the garden, where he wanted to think out an idea or two for his coming speeches, when the rat caught him by the arm. Toad rather suspected what he was after, and did his best to get away, but when the badger took him firmly by the other arm, he began to see that the game was up. The two animals conducted him between them into a small smoking room that opened out of the entrance hall, shut the door, and put him in a chair. Then they both stood in front of him, while Toad sat silent and regarded them with much suspicion and ill humour. "Now look here, Toad," said the rat. "It's about this banquet. And very sorry I am to speak to you like this, but we want you to understand clearly, once and for all, that there are going to be no speeches and no songs. Try and grasp the fact that on this occasion we are not arguing with you, we are just telling you." Toad saw that he was trapped. They understood him, they saw through him, they had got ahead of him. His pleasant dream was shattered. "Mind I sing just one little song?" he pleaded piteously. "No, not one little song," replied the rat firmly, though his heart bled as he noticed the trembling lip of poor disappointed Toad. "It's no good, Toady. You know well that your songs are all conceit and boasting and vanity, and your speeches are all self-praise and, well, gross exaggeration, and gas," put in the badger in his common way. "It's for your own good, Toady," went on the rat. "You know you must turn over a new leaf sooner or later, and now seems a splendid time to begin, a sort of turning point in your career. Please don't think that saying all this doesn't hurt me more than it hurts you." Toad remained a long while plunged in thought. At last he raised his head, and the traces of strong emotion were visible on his features. "You have conquered, my friends," he said in broken accents. "It was, to be sure, but a small thing that I asked, merely leave to blossom and expand, for yet one more evening, to let myself go and hear the tumultuous applause that always seems to me, somehow, to bring out my best qualities. However, you are right, I know, and I am wrong. Henceforth I will be a very different Toad. My friends, you shall never have occasion to blush for me again. But, oh dear, this is a hard world." And pressing his handkerchief to his face, he left the room with faltering footsteps. "Badger," said Rat, "I feel like a brute. I wonder what you feel like." "Oh, I know," said Badger gloomily. "But the thing had to be done. This good fellow has got to live here and hold his own and be respected. Would you have him common laughing-stock mocked and jeered at by stoats and weasels?" "Of course not," said Rat. "And talking of weasels, it's lucky that we came upon that little weasel, just as he was setting out with Toad's invitations. I suspected something from what you told me, and I had a look at one or two. They were simply disgraceful. I confiscated the lot, and the good mole is now sitting in the blue boudoir filling up plain, simple invitation cards." At last the hour of the banquet began to draw near, and Toad, who on leaving the others had retired to his bedroom, was still sitting there, melancholy and thoughtful. His brow resting on his paw, he pondered long and deeply. Gradually his countenance cleared, and he began to smile long, slow smiles. Then he took to giggling in a shy, self-conscious manner. At last he got up, locked the door, drew the curtains across the windows, collected all the chairs in the room, and arranged them in a semicircle, and took up his position in front of them, swelling visibly. Then he bowed, coughed twice, and letting himself go, with uplifted voice, he sang, to the enraptured audience that his imagination so clearly saw. Toad's last little song. The toad came home. There was panic in the parlour and howling in the hall. There was crying in the cowshed and streaking in the stall. When the toad came home. When the toad came home, there was smashing in of window and crashing in of door. There was chivying of weasels that fainted on the floor. When the toad came home. Bang go the drums, the trumpeters are tooting and the soldiers are saluting, and the cannon they are shooting and the motor cars are hooting, as the hero comes. Shout, hooray! And let each one of the crowd try and shout it very loud, in honour of an animal whom you've justly proud, for it's Toad's great day. He sang this very loud, and with great unction and expression, and when he had done he sang it all over again. Then he heaved a deep sigh, a long, long, long sigh. Then he dipped his hairbrush in the water jug, parted his hair in the middle, and plastered it down very straight and sleek on each side of his face. And unlocking the door, he went quietly down the stairs to greet his guests, who he knew must be assembling in the drawing-room. All the animals cheered when he entered and crowded around to congratulate him and say nice things about his courage and his cleverness and his fighting qualities, but Toad only smiled faintly and murmured, "Not at all," or sometimes, for a change, "On the contrary." Otter, who was standing on the hearthrug, describing to an admiring circle of friends exactly how he would have managed things had he been there, came forward with a shout, threw his arm round Toad's neck, and tried to take him round the room in triumphal progress. But Toad, in a mild way, was rather snubby to him, remarking gently as he disengaged himself, "Badgers was the mastermind. The mole and the water rat bore the brunt of the fighting. I merely served in the ranks and did little or nothing." The animals were evidently puzzled and taken aback by this unexpected attitude of his, and Toad felt, as he moved from one guest to the other, making his modest responses, that he was an object of absorbing interest to everyone. The Badger had ordered everything of the best, and the banquet was a great success. There was much talking and laughter and chaff among the animals, but through it all Toad, who of course was in the chair, looked down his nose and murmured pleasant nothings to the animals on either side of him. At intervals he stole a glance at the Badger and the Rat, and always when he looked they were staring at each other with their mouths open, and this gave him the greatest satisfaction. Some of the younger and livelier animals, as the evening wore on, got whispering to each other that things were not so amusing as they used to be in the good old days, and there were some knockings on the table and cries of "Toad! Speech! Speech from Toad! Song! Mr. Toad's song!" But Toad only shook his head gently, raised one paw in mild protest, and, by pressing delicacies on his guests, by topical small talk, and by earnest inquiries after members of their families not yet old enough to appear at the social functions, managed to convey to them that this dinner was being run on strictly conventional lines. He was indeed an altered Toad. After this climax, the four animals continued to lead their lives, so rudely broken in upon by civil war, in great joy and contentment, undisturbed by further risings or invasions. Toad, after due consultation with his friends, selected a handsome gold chain and locket set with pearls, which he dispatched to the gaoler's daughter with a letter that even the Badger admitted to be modest, grateful, and appreciative. And the engine driver, in his turn, was properly thanked and compensated for all his pains and trouble. Under severe compulsion from the Badger, even the bargewoman was with some trouble sought out, and the value of her horse discreetly made good to her, though Toad kicked terribly at this, holding himself to be an instrument of fate, sent to punish fat women with mottled arms who couldn't tell a real gentleman when they saw one. The amount involved, it was true, was not very burdensome, the gypsy's valuation being admitted by local assessors to be approximately correct. Sometimes, in the course of long summer evenings, the friends would take a stroll together in the wild wood, now successfully tamed so far as they were concerned, and it was pleasing to see how respectfully they were greeted by the inhabitants, and how the mother weasels would bring the young ones to the mouths of their holes and say, pointing, "Look, baby, there goes the great Mr. Toad, and that's the gallant water rat, a terrible fighter, walking along a him, and yonder comes the famous Mr. Mole, of whom you have often heard your father tell." But when their infants were fractious and quite beyond control, they would quiet them by telling how, if they didn't hush them and not fret them, the terrible grey Badger would up and get them. This was a base libel on Black Badger, who, though he cared little about society, was rather fond of children, but it never failed to have its full effect. The end. I hope you've enjoyed listening to our readings of Wind in the Willows. See you next time.